Just before being executed, man confesses something that leaves everyone in shock. An elderly man sits silently in the electric chair, his expression calm. Yet his story holds decades of buried secrets. Just hours before his execution, an unexpected truth emerges, one that could shake an entire city to its core. What happened in the hours leading to this moment left everyone stunned and searching for answers. Because sometimes silence hides the deepest betrayals. In the quiet heart of Charleston, Grace Caldwell stumbles upon a forgotten journal hidden among her late grandmother's belongings. What begins as a quest to clear her grandfather's name spirals into a harrowing discovery, a shadowy network with ties to some of the city's most powerful figures. As Grace peels back layers of lies, she finds herself entangled in a web of danger, where every truth uncovered comes with a price. How far will she go to expose the secrets that others would kill to keep buried? The dim light of the courtroom cast long shadows over the rows of wooden benches. The air was heavy with murmurs as the jury foreman stood, holding the verdict in trembling hands. Grace Caldwell sat rigid in the front row, her heart pounding as the words she feared echoed through the chamber. Guilty of first-degree murder. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by an oppressive silence. Ethan Caldwell, her grandfather, sat motionless, his shoulders stooped under the weight of the pronouncement. His calm expression defied the storm brewing in Grace's mind. How could the system condemn a man like him, a retired professor, a man who had spent his life teaching history and cultivating gardens, for such a heinous crime? Ethan rose slowly as the judge began to address him. His once proud frame now appeared frail, his hair a crown of silver. Yet his voice, when he spoke, carried the same quiet authority that had captivated his students for decades. Your Honor, I accept the sentence, but I maintain my innocence. There are truths more dangerous than lies, and sometimes silence is the only shield. His words drew confused glances and whispered speculations from the audience, but Grace felt her throat tighten. This was not the defiant proclamation of an innocent man, but the cryptic resignation of someone hiding something profound. As Ethan was led away in handcuffs, Grace remained seated, her thoughts spiraling. Her hands clutched her notebook tightly, its pages filled with notes from the trial. The prosecution had painted Ethan as a man consumed by revenge, driven to murder Margaret Whitmore, a local philanthropist. They claimed he strangled her in her Charleston mansion after a heated argument. The evidence had seemed damning. Ethan's fingerprints on a teacup and on Margaret's neck, the fibers of his coat found at the scene. But none of it made sense to Grace. Her grandfather wasn't a murderer. He was a man who could barely raise his voice, let alone his hands in violence. Later that evening, Grace sat in her cluttered apartment, staring at the photo she had taken from the evidence presented during the trial. It showed Margaret Whitmore in her youth, standing outside a now-abandoned orphanage on Charleston's outskirts. The name Whitmore Home for Children was etched in faded letters on the building behind her. Grace flipped the photo over, her pulse quickening as she read the handwritten note on the back. Project Heritage, 1972. She had never heard of this project before, and a quick online search yielded no useful results. The name felt significant, connected to the broader story Margaret had been trying to tell before her death. Determined to find answers, Grace drove to her grandfather's modest home on the edge of town. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias, and the moonlight illuminated the garden where Ethan had spent countless hours tending to his beloved flowers. Inside, the house felt empty, its warmth absent without its inhabitant. Grace moved to his study, where books and framed photographs adorned the walls. She found a stack of letters on his desk, all addressed to her unopened. One stood out. It was dated 3 months ago, just before his arrest. The letter was brief but heavy with meaning. "My dearest Grace," it began. "If you are reading this, then you know I have been accused of something unimaginable. I cannot speak the truth. It would put too many lives at risk. Trust your instincts and follow the trail. Start with Margaret Whitmore. She knew more than she was ever allowed to say. You have always been my brightest light. With love, Granddad. Grace's hands trembled as she finished reading. Ethan's words confirmed her suspicions. His silence wasn't guilt, it was fear. The following morning, Grace made her way to the Whitmore Home for Children, now a dilapidated building swallowed by overgrown ivy. The air was still, save for the occasional creak of wood under her feet as she stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, streaming through broken windows. In a back room, she found rusted filing cabinets, their drawers jammed shut. After several attempts, she pried one open and discovered a trove of documents. Among them were adoption records spanning decades, with several marked Project Heritage. The name reappeared frequently, alongside Margaret Whitmore's signature as a witness. One file stopped Grace cold. It listed children's names, including a young boy identified only as Samuel W., with the notation, adopted by Whitmore family, 1972. The birth certificate had been redacted, leaving only the initials of the biological parents. M.W. and E.C. Grace's breath caught. Could Samuel W. be Judge Samuel Whitmore? And if so, what did it mean that Margaret was listed as his biological mother? Grace quickly photographed the documents with her phone, her mind racing with questions. If this information was true, then her grandfather and Margaret Whitmore shared a deeper connection than anyone had revealed. As Grace left the orphanage, she noticed a black car parked across the street. Its windows were tinted and the engine idled quietly. She felt a chill run down her spine. Someone was watching her. She hurried to her car, glancing back only once to see the black car pull away, disappearing into the distance. Her heart pounded as she gripped the steering wheel. Whoever they were, they knew she was digging into something they wanted to keep buried. That night, as Grace sat in her car outside the prison, she debated whether to confront her grandfather with what she had found. Would he answer her questions, or would he maintain his cryptic silence? She clenched a photograph of Margaret Whitmore in her hand, the words Project Heritage echoing in her mind. If the truth was as dangerous as Ethan claimed, then she needed to know why, and she needed to know now. The morning air was damp with the promise of rain as Grace parked her car in front of the Charleston Historical Society. She had spent most of the night combing through the documents she had recovered from the Whitmore Home for Children, trying to piece together the fragments of a larger story. The orphanage's name seemed to vanish from public records after the late 1970s, and the mentions of Project Heritage were too sporadic to provide clarity. However, a surviving ledger from the orphanage hinted at something sinister, a pattern of children being adopted into powerful families, while others disappeared without a trace. Inside the Historical Society, the archivist, a stern woman named Evelyn Shaw, greeted Grace with thinly veiled impatience. "You're looking for what exactly?" Evelyn asked, peering over her glasses. Grace unfolded a copy of the photograph, showing Margaret Whitmore standing in front of the orphanage. "I'm researching the Whitmore Home for Children. Specifically, I'm trying to understand its connection to Margaret Whitmore and something called Project Heritage." Evelyn's eyes narrowed at the mention of the project's name. "That's a name I haven't heard in years," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But if you're looking for records, most of them were sealed when the orphanage closed." "What's your interest?" Grace hesitated before answering. "My grandfather is facing execution for Margaret Whitmore's murder. I think he's innocent, and I believe this orphanage holds part of the answer." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, and she gestured for Grace to follow. "We might have something in the restricted archives. But I warn you, whatever you're digging into, tread carefully. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed." The archives were housed in the basement, where rows of shelves stretched into the dimly lit space. Evelyn pointed to a corner where older files were stored and left Grace to her search. Hours passed as Grace sifted through yellowed papers, brittle with age. Finally, she stumbled upon a box labeled Whitmore Orphanage, Special Records. Inside, she found adoption papers stamped with the name Project Heritage. Most of the children had no listed parents, but their adoption files were marked with cryptic notations: G7, H3, B2. Grace photographed every page she could, unsure of their meaning but certain of their importance. One file, however, stood out. It contained an application for funding submitted by Margaret Whitmore to a government agency, requesting support for a program designed to place orphaned children in stable environments to foster leadership potential. Attached to the application was a list of children who had been part of the program. Grace's stomach churned as she read the names. Some were now prominent business leaders, judges, and politicians. Others were marked as missing or simply discontinued. At the bottom of the list, a note scrawled in Margaret's handwriting read, "Ethical concerns growing. Must reconsider involvement." As Grace photographed the documents, a faint noise caught her attention. A shuffle of footsteps above her. She froze, listening. The building had been empty apart from Evelyn, who had gone back upstairs hours ago. The footsteps grew louder, and she heard the creak of the basement door opening. Panic surged as she hurriedly stuffed the documents back into the box and grabbed her phone. The footsteps descended the stairs, heavy and deliberate, but whoever it was didn't call out. Grace ducked behind a shelf, her heart racing. She clutched her phone, preparing to call for help, when the figure stopped near the entrance to the archives. A man in a dark suit stood silhouetted against a faint light from the stairwell. He scanned the room briefly before turning and retreating up the stairs. Grace waited until she could no longer hear his footsteps before emerging from her hiding spot. The unease lingered as she left the building, casting nervous glances over her shoulder. If someone was already trying to interfere, it meant she was on the right track, but also in real danger. Determined to make sense of what she had found, Grace drove to the Charleston Public Library to continue her research. She delved into the city's newspapers from the 1970s, hoping to find any mention of Project Heritage or the orphanage's operations. As she scrolled through microfilm, a headline from 1974 caught her eye. Margaret Whitmore launches initiative to support at-risk children. The article praised Margaret's efforts but mentioned pushback from community leaders who claimed the program was secretive and lacked transparency. More disturbing was an editorial published years later, in 1979, just before the orphanage closed. The piece accused the Whitmore Home for Children of being part of a larger scheme, suggesting that children were disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Despite claims of adoption success stories, the article read, sources suggest a darker undercurrent involving unauthorized experiments and political grooming. The journalist who wrote it, Thomas Hargrove, died in a car accident the following year, a detail that felt too convenient to Grace. As she pieced these threads together, her phone buzzed with a message. It was Evelyn Shaw. "You left something behind. Come back." Grace frowned, realizing she hadn't left anything in the archives. Still, she felt compelled to return. When she arrived, Evelyn was waiting with a file in her hands. "I thought this might interest you," she said, her voice low. "I found it after you left." The file was labeled Margaret Whitmore, Personal Notes. It contained pages of handwritten thoughts, many of them fragmented but revealing. Margaret had kept detailed records of her growing doubts about Project Heritage. One entry read, "Funding sources suspicious. Connections to federal agencies unclear. Children's futures being decided without consent." Another, more chilling, stated, "If anything happens to me, look to the files under G7. Everything is there." Grace thanked Evelyn and quickly left, her mind racing. Back in her car, she flipped through the notes again, her fingers trembling. The mention of G7 reminded her of the notations in the adoption record she had found earlier. If Margaret had suspected foul play and tried to stop it, her actions might have been what led to her death. Grace's suspicions grew. Whoever had funded Project Heritage had a vested interest in silencing Margaret, and now, perhaps, Grace herself. As she drove home, headlights appeared in her rear-view mirror, closer than they should have been. The car stayed on her tail as she turned down a side street. then another. Her pulse quickened, and she pulled into a gas station, hoping the driver would pass. Instead, the car stopped across the lot, its engine still running. Grace stared at the car, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and called the police. But by the time they arrived, the car had disappeared into the night. Back at her apartment, Grace spread the documents and notes across her desk. Her mind was a whirlwind of connections and unanswered questions. Who was behind Project Heritage? Why had Margaret stayed involved despite her concerns? And what did her grandfather know that made him so certain his silence was necessary? The weight of these mysteries pressed on Grace as she stared at the name Whitmore written in Margaret's elegant hand. She resolved to visit the one place where answers might still be found, the Whitmore estate itself. Somewhere in the shadows, she knew someone was watching her every move. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the visitation room at Charleston Correctional Facility, casting a cold glow over the bare walls. Grace sat across from her grandfather, the heavy glass partition separating them as stark as the distance she felt between his secrets and her growing determination. Ethan Caldwell looked older than she remembered, his skin pale and drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the phone on his side. His gaze met hers, tired yet unwavering, and Grace's throat tightened as she struggled to find the right words. "I went to the Whitmore home," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I found adoption records. Margaret was connected to a program called Project Heritage. Ethan held up a hand to stop her, his expression hardening. "Grace, you shouldn't have gone there. You shouldn't be digging into this." His tone caught her off guard. "Granddad, I'm trying to help you. You didn't kill Margaret. I know that. But if you don't tell me what's going on, how can I clear your name?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "What are you so afraid of?" Ethan sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of her questions was too much to bear. "Grace, you're asking for answers that come with consequences. Margaret and I both knew the risks of what we uncovered. I made my peace with this long before you were born." "But I haven't," Grace shot back, her frustration bubbling over. "You're willing to die for secrets, but you won't tell me what they are?" Margaret was trying to expose something, wasn't she? That's why she was killed. And you're protecting something, by staying silent. Ethan's eyes softened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the grandfather she knew, the man who used to tell her bedtime stories about heroes and sacrifice. "Grace, if you push too far, you'll put yourself in danger. You need to let this go." "I can't," she replied firmly. "I won't. I found adoption records. I found files marked with codes like G7. I know Samuel Whitmore was one of the children placed through Project Heritage. And I know Margaret suspected something bigger was happening. So, unless you plan to sit in that cell and let them execute you without a fight, I need you to help me." Ethan's silence stretched, the pause feeling endless. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret was the bravest person I ever knew. But even bravery has limits. She was playing a dangerous game, Grace, and she lost. I can't let you make the same mistake." Grace stared at him, anger flaring in her chest. "You think staying silent is protecting me? All it's doing is letting the people who killed her and who framed you win." She leaned closer, her voice urgent. "If you won't tell me, I'll find out on my own." The phone clicked as Ethan hung up abruptly, leaving Grace staring at his retreating figure. Her frustration boiled over, but beneath it was a gnawing worry. What could possibly be so dangerous that her grandfather, a man who had always taught her to stand up for the truth, was willing to take it to his grave? As Grace exited the prison, the gray clouds overhead mirrored her mood. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fished it out to see a message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions. It won't end well for you." Her stomach dropped, and her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the screen. She quickly scanned the parking lot, her eyes darting between parked cars, but no one stood out. Was someone watching her? Or was this just a scare tactic? Either way, it only strengthened her resolve. She refused to back down. Determined to find answers elsewhere, Grace drove to the Whitmore estate. The sprawling mansion sat at the edge of town, its grandeur marred by an air of neglect. Vines crept up its stone walls, and the gardens, once immaculate, were overgrown with weeds. Margaret's death had left the property in limbo, its secrets locked away behind closed doors. Grace parked at the edge of the long driveway and approached cautiously. She had called ahead, claiming she was a journalist writing a retrospective on Margaret's philanthropic legacy. A housekeeper greeted her at the door, her eyes wary but polite. "You'll have to be quick," the woman said. "The estate's being prepared for auction." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old wood. Margaret's presence lingered in every corner, from the photographs lining the walls to the books on the shelves. Grace's eyes lingered on one photograph in particular, a black and white portrait of a younger Margaret holding a baby. The inscription read, "My Samuel, my hope." Margaret had no biological children, right? Grace asked, her voice casual as she gestured to the photograph. The housekeeper hesitated before nodding. "That's what most people believe. But Miss Margaret was very private. I think she carried more secrets than anyone knew." Secrets. The word hung in the air as Grace continued her exploration. She entered Margaret's study, where a massive oak desk dominated the room. Its surface was bare, but a locked drawer caught her attention. She searched the room for a key, her heart pounding when she found one hidden in a hollowed-out book. The drawer creaked open, revealing a stack of letters bound with a ribbon. Grace flipped through them quickly, her breath catching as she recognized Ethan's handwriting. One letter stood out. It was dated a month before Margaret's death and read, "Margaret, I've warned you about the risks of pushing too hard. If they find out how much you know, they won't just come for you. They'll come for me and everyone else tied to this." Grace's fingers trembled as she read. Ethan had known Margaret's life was in danger. He had tried to stop her, and now he was paying the price for her determination. But what did Margaret know that was worth her life? Before she could dig further, the sound of tires crunching gravel outside jolted her. She peeked through the window and saw a black car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged as she realized it was the same car that had followed her the night before. She stuffed the letters into her bag and slipped out a side door, her heart pounding as she made her way back to her car. As she drove away, adrenaline coursing through her veins, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something dangerous. The letters, the records, the coded files. Everything pointed to a conspiracy far larger than she had imagined. And if the threats were anything to go by, she wasn't the only one chasing the truth. Back at her apartment, Grace spread the letters and documents across her desk. She knew she was running out of time. Ethan's execution date loomed closer, and the people behind Project Heritage were clearly willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. But for Grace, this wasn't just about saving her grandfather anymore. It was about justice for Margaret, for the children whose lives had been stolen, and for the truth itself. And if her grandfather wouldn't speak, she would have to uncover the truth on her own, no matter the cost. Grace sat on the courthouse steps, her mind spinning as she reread the letters she had taken from Margaret Whitmore's study. Ethan's warnings were clear. Margaret had been investigating Project Heritage and had gotten too close to the truth. But the letters raised more questions than answers. Who were the people behind the program? Why had they gone to such lengths to silence Margaret? And, most pressing of all, how was her grandfather connected to it? Inside the courthouse, Judge Samuel Whitmore was presiding over a high-profile case. Grace slipped into the back of the courtroom, watching him closely. His demeanor was as polished as ever, exuding authority and control. But as he questioned witnesses and ruled on objections, Grace couldn't shake the memory of the adoption record she had found. Samuel's name had been listed as one of the children adopted through Project Heritage. If Margaret was his biological mother, did he know? And if so, how far would he go to protect that secret? After the session ended, Grace approached one of the reporters milling about. "What's Whitmore's reputation?" she asked casually, holding her notebook to appear as though she was conducting an interview. The reporter, a wiry man in his 40s, snorted. "He's untouchable. Been on the bench for years, and his connections run deep. You don't rise this high in Charleston without making a few deals behind closed doors." Grace's stomach churned. If Whitmore was as powerful as he seemed, exposing his connection to Project Heritage wouldn't just be difficult. It could be dangerous. Still, she couldn't ignore the evidence she had gathered. She decided to confront him directly. The next morning, Grace waited outside Whitmore's chambers. When he finally appeared, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Judge Whitmore," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. "I'm Grace Caldwell, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about Margaret Whitmore." Whitmore paused, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "I don't discuss personal matters," he said curtly. "If you're here to dredge up gossip, I suggest you find a different subject." "This isn't gossip," Grace countered, holding up a copy of the adoption record with his name on it. "I found this in the Whitmore Homes archives. It says you were adopted through a program called Project Heritage. Did you know Margaret was your biological mother?" Whitmore's face froze, a flicker of shock crossing his features before he masked it with practiced indifference. "I don't know where you got that, but I suggest you tread carefully, Miss Caldwell. You're playing a dangerous game." "Why is it dangerous?" Grace pressed. "Because Margaret tried to expose the truth? Because you know what happened to her? Or is it because you're protecting the people who ran the program?" Whitmore's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Grace thought he might answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway, frustration boiling in her chest. His reaction confirmed her suspicions. He knew more than he was letting on, and he was determined to keep it buried. That evening, Grace met with an old contact, a retired journalist named Frank Mendez. Frank had covered Charleston's political scene for decades before retiring, and Grace hoped he might know something about Project Heritage. They met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, where Frank listened intently as Grace explained what she had uncovered. "Project Heritage," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "I remember hearing whispers about it back in the 70s. There were rumors of a program that took kids from poor families and placed them with influential ones. Supposedly, it was about giving them a better future, but I always thought there was more to it." "Like what?" Grace asked, leaning forward. Frank shrugged. "Hard to say. Some people thought it was a social experiment, testing whether environment could outweigh biology. Others said it was about control, creating a generation of leaders loyal to the people who put them there. Whatever it was, it disappeared when the Whitmore home closed. Margaret stopped talking about it, and most folks moved on. But if she was digging it up again before she died, you can bet it wasn't for a feel-good story." Grace's thoughts raced as she processed Frank's words. Project Heritage wasn't just a misguided charity program. It was something much darker. And if Margaret had been investigating it, she might have uncovered secrets that implicated powerful people, including Whitmore. Before Grace could ask more questions, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an anonymous sender with the subject line, "Follow the money." Attached was a series of scanned documents, financial records linking Project Heritage to a shadowy network of donors. Grace's eyes widened as she recognized several names. Influential business leaders, judges, and even a senator. These weren't just benefactors. They were beneficiaries, connected to the program in ways that suggested complicity. "Where did you get that?" Frank asked, peering over her shoulder. "I don't know," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it proves there's more to this than I thought." As she left the diner, Grace's mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. The financial records were a goldmine, but they also raised new questions. Who had sent them to her, and why? If someone wanted her to expose Project Heritage, it meant she wasn't alone in her fight, but it also meant she was being watched. The next day, Grace took the records to a lawyer who had worked on cases involving corruption. The lawyer, Amanda Price, examined the documents with a critical eye. "This is damning," Amanda said, her voice tinged with both awe and caution. "If these are real, they could take down half the city's elite. But getting them into court won't be easy. You'll need a credible witness." Grace thought of Whitmore and his connection to the program. If she could get him to testify, or at least admit the truth, it could break the case wide open. But convincing him to betray the people who had elevated him to power would be nearly impossible. Still, she had to try. That evening, Grace returned to the courthouse and waited outside Whitmore's car. When he appeared, she stepped into his path, holding up the financial records. "I know about the donors," she said, her voice firm. "I know Project Heritage wasn't about helping kids. It was about creating a network of control. And I know you're part of it." Whitmore's expression darkened, and for a moment, Grace thought he might lash out. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know what you're dealing with. These people built this city. They built everything you see. If you think you can take them down, you're a fool." "Maybe," Grace shot back. "But Margaret thought it was worth trying. And so do I." Whitmore stared at her, his jaw tight. Finally, he sighed, the fight seeming to drain from him. "Margaret never stopped believing in the truth," he said, almost to himself, "even when it cost her everything." Grace felt a pang of sympathy for the man, but she couldn't let it soften her resolve. "Then do the right thing," she urged. "Help me expose them. Testify. Tell the truth." Whitmore didn't answer. He turned and climbed into his car, leaving Grace standing alone in the dim light of the parking lot. But as she watched him drive away, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her think he might not stay silent forever. Back at her apartment, Grace reviewed the evidence she had gathered, her determination growing. The financial records, the adoption files, and the letters from Margaret painted a damning picture. But she needed more. If she could find a direct link between Project Heritage and Margaret's death, it could prove Ethan's innocence and bring the truth to light. As she stared at the documents spread across her desk, her phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "You're getting close. Be careful." Grace's breath hitched as she read the words. Someone was watching her, someone who knew what she was uncovering. But instead of fear, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The Whitmore estate loomed large and silent in the dusk, its shadow stretching over the overgrown grounds like a specter. Grace gripped her flashlight tightly as she slipped through a gap in the wrought iron gate. She knew she was trespassing, but this was the only way. The clues were stacking up, pointing her back to this place where Margaret Whitmore had lived and died. Somewhere in this house, Grace was certain, lay the evidence Margaret had been killed for. It wasn't just about Project Heritage. It was about the power it gave to those who controlled it. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of old wood settling. Grace avoided turning on lights, relying instead on the narrow beam of her flashlight. The main floor had already been combed through during her previous visit, but something about the estate's layout felt off. Margaret's files and letters hinted at a hidden lair to the house, a space where she had stored her most sensitive discoveries. Grace's fingers trailed along the walls, searching for any sign of a concealed door or passage. Her search led her to the study, with a scent of aged books mingled with the faint metallic tang of disuse. She crouched by the massive oak desk, running her fingers along its edges. Her flashlight's beam caught something peculiar, scuff marks on the hardwood floor near one of the bookcases. Grace pressed her hand against the shelves, and with a faint creak, the bookcase shifted slightly, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Her pulse quickened as she made her way down the steps, each creak of it echoing ominously in the confined space. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of damp earth and mildew. At the bottom, Grace found herself in a small basement, the walls lined with shelves cluttered with boxes and dusty file cabinets. The room was lit by a single naked bulb, its dim glow casting flickering shadows. Grace began to sift through the files, her hands trembling with anticipation. Many of the documents were old invoices, property deeds, and mundane estate records. But one box caught her attention. It was labeled Heritage Private. Inside, she found folders filled with adoption records, medical files, and correspondence. Her heart raced as she realized these were the missing pieces of the puzzle. Proof of Project Heritage's operation and its impact on dozens of children. One folder stood out, marked with the code G7, a reference Margaret had mentioned in her notes. Grace opened it carefully, her breath hitching as she read the contents. The file contained profiles of children placed in prominent families, including detailed psychological evaluations, test scores, and even surveillance reports. It wasn't just an adoption program. It was a social experiment. The program's architects were studying how these children adapted to their environments, molding them into future leaders, judges, and business moguls. Among the profiles, she found Samuel Whitmore's. The file confirmed he was Margaret's biological son, taken from her at birth and placed with the Whitmore family under the guise of adoption. The file noted that Samuel had been chosen for his strong temperament and leadership potential, qualities that had been reinforced by his upbringing. Grace's stomach churned as she realized Samuel's entire life had been engineered by people who saw him as nothing more than a pawn. As Grace photographed the documents, her flashlight flickered. She froze, listening. The faint sound of footsteps echoed above her, growing louder as they approached the basement stairs. Panic surged as she scrambled to pack the files into her bag. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, and a shadow fell across the narrow doorway. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry to announce themselves. "Who's down there?" A deep voice called, sharp and commanding. Grace's mind raced. If she responded, she risked confrontation. If she stayed silent, they might come down anyway. She took a deep breath and stepped into the light. "It's just me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Grace Caldwell. I'm investigating Margaret Whitmore's murder." The man descended slowly, his features coming into view. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a badge clipped to his belt. "Detective Harper," he said, his tone wary. "You're trespassing, Miss Caldwell. Care to explain why?" Grace hesitated, then held up the file she had been photographing. "Because no one else is investigating this," she said bluntly. Margaret Whitmore uncovered something massive, a program called Project Heritage. It wasn't just an adoption program. It was a way to control the futures of these children. And someone killed her to keep it quiet. Harper studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're talking about old conspiracy theories. I've been in Charleston long enough to hear plenty of them. Why should I believe you?" Grace pulled out her phone and showed him the photographs she had taken of the documents. "Because this isn't a theory. It's real, and it involves some of the most powerful people in this city, including Judge Whitmore." At the mention of the judge's name, Harper's expression darkened. "You need to be careful," he said after a long pause. "People who dig into things like this don't always come out unscathed." "Is that a threat?" Grace asked, her voice sharp. "No," Harper said, his tone softening. "It's a warning, but I'll take a look at what you've got." He gestured for her to follow him out of the basement. "We can't talk here. Let's go somewhere safer." Reluctantly, Grace followed Harper out of the estate, the weight of the files heavy in her bag. They drove to a quiet diner on the edge of town, where Harper reviewed the photos on her phone. His skepticism faded as he flipped through the images, his brow furrowing deeper with each new piece of evidence. "This isn't just bad," he muttered. "It's catastrophic. If this gets out, it'll tear the city apart." "That's the point," Grace said. "These people have been manipulating lives for decades. They need to be exposed." Harper leaned back in the booth, his expression grim. "If you're serious about this, you need allies. Powerful ones. You can't take down people like Whitmore on your own." Grace thought of her grandfather, sitting silently in his cell, and of Margaret, who had paid the ultimate price for her pursuit of the truth. "I don't have a choice," she said. "I've already come too far." As Harper nodded, Grace's phone buzzed with a new message. It was another anonymous tip, this time with a single line. "Check the Whitmore Foundation accounts." Her pulse quickened. If the foundation's financial records were connected to Project Heritage, it could provide the final proof she needed. "Then let's start there," Harper said, reading over her shoulder. "But you'd better be ready for what you're about to uncover. Once this genie's out of the bottle, there's no putting it back." Grace nodded, determination burning in her chest. The truth was closer than ever, and she wasn't going to stop until she had it all. The office of Judge Samuel Whitmore, with its dark wood paneling and shelves lined with leather-bound books, exuded power and authority. Grace sat stiffly in one of the high-backed chairs, her bag heavy with the evidence she had gathered. Across the desk, Samuel studied her with a cool, detached expression, his fingers steepled in front of him. The weight of his gaze made the room feel smaller. But Grace refused to be intimidated. She was here for answers. "You were insistent," Samuel said finally, his voice calm but firm. "So, tell me, Miss Caldwell, what is it you want?" Grace met his gaze, her heart pounding. "I want the truth. About Project Heritage. About Margaret. About your connection to all of it." Samuel's jaw tightened, a flicker of something, anger perhaps, passing through his eyes. "You've been chasing shadows, digging where you don't belong. Whatever you think you've uncovered, I assure you, it's nothing more than old rumors." Grace didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out the file labeled G7, placing it on the desk between them. "I found this in Margaret's study. It's your file, Judge Whitmore. It confirms that you were adopted through Project Heritage and that Margaret was your biological mother. Did you know?" For a moment, Samuel said nothing. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of pain quickly suppressed. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his hands dropping to his lap. "I've always known I was adopted," he said slowly, "but I never sought out the details. Margaret never told me, and I never asked. But you knew," Grace pressed. "You knew she was your mother, and you knew about Project Heritage. Why didn't you do anything to stop it?" Samuel's face darkened, his polished exterior cracking. "Stop it? Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Project Heritage wasn't some charity program gone astray. It was a carefully constructed machine designed by people who understood how power works. By the time I realized what it was, I was already part of it. And you just went along with it?" Grace shot back, her voice rising. "You let them use you?" Samuel's hands clenched into fists on the desk. "Do you think I had a choice? I was a child, raised to believe I was special, chosen. By the time I understood the truth, they had already shaped my entire life. My education, my career, even my relationships. Everything was orchestrated to serve their agenda. And when I tried to break free," he stopped, his jaw tightening as he struggled for control. "When you tried to break free, what?" Grace prompted. Samuel hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "They made it clear what would happen if I stepped out of line. Margaret tried to fight them, and look where it got her. She wanted to dismantle the program, to expose the people behind it. She thought she could protect me, but all she did was make herself a target." Grace felt a pang of sympathy despite her anger. "So you stayed quiet. You let them use you, even after Margaret was killed." Samuel's expression hardened again. "I did what I had to do to survive. And now you're here, thinking you can waltz into my office with a handful of papers and take down an entire system? You have no idea what you're up against." Grace leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "I'm not afraid of them. Margaret wasn't afraid, and neither am I. If you really cared about her, you'll help me expose the truth." Samuel's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. Finally, he sighed and stood, walking to the window. The sunlight streaming and illuminated the lines of tension etched into his face. "Do you know why Margaret kept Project Heritage going? Even after she saw what it really was? He asked, his voice distant. Grace shook her head. No, because she thought she could fix it, Samuel said bitterly. She believed she could turn it into something good, something that would actually help people. But the program wasn't designed for good. It was designed for control. He turned back to face her, his expression grim. The people behind Project Heritage didn't just want to place children in powerful families. They wanted to create a generation of leaders who owed everything to them. Judges, politicians, CEOs, all tied to the same web. Margaret thought she could change that, but all she did was make herself a threat. Grace's mind raced as she processed his words. And you? What did you do? Samuel's gaze hardened. I survived, and I suggest you do the same. Grace stood, anger and frustration bubbling over. You're a coward, she said, her voice trembling. You let them kill Margaret. You let them frame my grandfather. And now you're telling me to walk away? No, I won't. Samuel flinched, but his expression remained cold. You don't understand what you're dealing with. These people don't just destroy lives, they erase them. If you keep pushing, they'll come for you too. Let them, Grace snapped. I'd rather fight and lose than stay silent. She turned and walked out of his office, her heart pounding. As she stepped into the hallway, she glanced back and saw Samuel still standing by the window, his silhouette framed by the sunlight. He looked like a man haunted by his choices, but Grace couldn't afford to pity him. She had work to do. Later that evening, Grace met with Detective Harper at a quiet cafe. She recounted her conversation with Samuel, her frustration evident. Harper listened intently, his brow furrowed. So he admits he knew about Project Heritage, but he won't help. He's too scared, Grace said bitterly, or too complicit. Either way, he's not going to do the right thing. Harper nodded slowly. Then we'll have to find another way. Together, they reviewed the documents Grace had gathered, piecing together the program's operations. The financial records, adoption files, and Samuel's reluctant admissions painted a damning picture, but they still lacked one critical piece: direct evidence linking Project Heritage to Margaret's murder. As they worked late into the night, Grace's phone buzzed with a new message. It was another anonymous tip. Check the Whitmore Foundation accounts. The answers are there. Grace's heart raced. The Whitmore Foundation had been Margaret's primary philanthropic endeavor, but if it was tied to Project Heritage, it could be the smoking gun they needed. She and Harper agreed to meet the next day to follow the lead, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Ethan's execution date loomed closer, and the people behind Project Heritage were watching her every move. As she drove home, Grace replayed Samuel's words in her mind. He was right about one thing. She didn't fully understand what she was up against, but she couldn't walk away, not now. Margaret had believed in the power of truth, and Grace intended to honor her legacy. The next steps were clear. She had to follow the money, uncover the Foundation's secrets, and find the proof that would expose the people who had manipulated so many lives. And if that meant going deeper into the shadows, so be it. The truth was worth the risk. The Whitmore Foundation's headquarters were housed in a sleek glass building in the heart of Charleston's financial district. To most of the city, the foundation represented Margaret Whitmore's legacy, a charitable organization dedicated to education and community development. But to Grace, it was the next step in unraveling the truth behind Project Heritage. If the anonymous tip was correct, the foundation's accounts held the answers she needed. Grace arrived in the early afternoon, her laptop tucked under her arm and her nerves tightly coiled. She had secured a meeting with the foundation's financial officer, posing as a freelance journalist interested in writing a retrospective on Margaret's philanthropy. The receptionist led her to a conference room where a thin, balding man greeted her with a polite smile. "Ms. Caldwell, I'm Richard Halston," he said, extending a hand. "I understand you're here to learn more about the Foundation's history." "That's right," Grace said, forcing a smile as they shook hands. "Margaret Whitmore's work has always fascinated me, especially her efforts with the Foundation. I'm hoping to delve deeper into how her vision translated into action." Halston nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Margaret's legacy is one we're incredibly proud of. The foundation has funded dozens of scholarships, community programs, and educational initiatives. We've made a lasting impact on Charleston. Grace listened politely as Halston recited the foundation's public achievements, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on how she could pivot the conversation to Project Heritage without raising suspicion. When Halston paused, she seized her chance. Margaret's work truly was remarkable, Grace said, but I've come across mentions of a program she was involved in, something called Project Heritage. Do you know if the foundation had any connection to it? Halston's smile faltered, and a flicker of unease crossed his face. Project Heritage? He repeated, his tone carefully neutral. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that. Grace's pulse quickened. He was lying. She decided to press further. That's surprising. I found records indicating that some of the foundation's early funding came from donors linked to Project Heritage. I was hoping you could clarify that connection. Halston shifted in his chair, his discomfort growing. I'm not sure where you found those records, but the foundation's finances are entirely transparent. Every donation and grant is thoroughly vetted. Then you won't mind if I review them myself, Grace said, her tone firm. It's just due diligence for the article. Halston hesitated, his expression hardening. The foundation's financial records are private. If you have specific questions, I can address them, but I won't grant access to sensitive information. Grace bit back her frustration, forcing a smile. Of course, I understand. As Halston continued his carefully rehearsed answers, Grace's mind raced. She wouldn't get anywhere through direct questions, but there had to be another way. Her eyes flicked to the laptop open on the conference table. If she could gain access to the foundation's internal network, she might find what she needed. When the meeting ended, Grace thanked Halston and made her way to the restroom. Instead of leaving immediately, she slipped into a side hallway, looking for an open office. The building was quiet, most employees having left for lunch. She found an empty cubicle with a desktop computer still logged in and quickly sat down. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she navigated the foundation's system. She accessed the financial records, scrolling through years of transactions. Most of the donations were from legitimate sources, but as she delved deeper, she noticed a pattern. Several large contributions were listed under vague entity names like Heritage Trust and Future Foundations. The amounts were staggering, and the money often flowed through offshore accounts before landing in the foundation's coffers. Grace's heart pounded as she took screenshots of the transactions. These donations weren't just suspicious. They were evidence of something much larger. If these entities were tied to Project Heritage, they could expose the entire network behind the program. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. She quickly minimized the screen and pretended to be checking her phone as a man in a security uniform appeared. "Miss, you're not supposed to be here," he said, his tone firm. "I'm sorry," Grace said, standing quickly. "I must have taken a wrong turn. I'll leave now." The guard escorted her back to the lobby, his suspicious gaze following her until she stepped outside. Grace's hands were trembling as she walked to her car. The screenshots burned into her memory. She had found the financial trail, but now she needed to connect it to Margaret's death and Ethan's case. That evening, Grace met Detective Harper at a small bar on the outskirts of town. She showed him the screenshots, explaining what she had discovered. Harper's brow furrowed as he studied the transactions. These shell entities aren't just suspicious. They're a classic method for laundering money. If we can trace them back to their owners, we'll have a direct link to the people funding Project Heritage. But how do we do that? Grace asked. The accounts are offshore. They're designed to be untraceable. Harper tapped the table thoughtfully. We'll need a forensic accountant, someone who knows how to follow these kinds of trails. I know a guy. He's retired, but he owes me a favor. Within hours, Harper had arranged a meeting with the accountant, a grizzled man named Joe Kincaid. Over coffee at his cluttered home office, Grace and Harper explained the situation. Joe listened carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the screenshots. "This is messy," Joe said, leaning back in his chair. "But not impossible. These kinds of networks always leave breadcrumbs. Payments that don't quite add up, accounts that overlap. If you've got the stomach for it, I can help." "Whatever it takes," Grace said. The next few days were a blur of spreadsheets, account numbers, and late nights. Joe worked tirelessly, untangling the web of transactions. Grace and Harper provided whatever assistance they could, tracking down leads and cross-referencing names. Slowly but surely, a pattern emerged. The shell entities were all connected to a central account managed by an investment firm called Vanguard Horizons. "This firm," Joe explained, pointing to the data on his screen, "is a front. It's owned by a holding company that's tied to several high-profile donors, all of whom have connections to Project Heritage." Grace's breath caught as she read the names. Among them was Samuel Whitmore. "He's not just involved," she murmured. "He's one of the architects." Harper nodded grimly. "And he's not the only one. These names, politicians, CEOs, judges, they're a who's who of Charleston's elite." As the pieces fell into place, Grace felt a mixture of triumph and dread. She had uncovered the network behind Project Heritage, but exposing it would come at a cost. These weren't just powerful people. They were people who would do anything to protect their secrets. That night, as Grace reviewed the evidence, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You've gone too far. Back off, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. They were scared, and they should be. The truth was within reach, and she wasn't about to stop now. The final confrontation was coming. Grace could feel it, but she knew one thing for certain. Margaret Whitmore had died fighting for the truth, and Grace wouldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. The air was tense in Joe Kincaid's home office as Grace, Detective Harper, and a retired accountant pored over the last pieces of their investigation. The financial trail they had uncovered was damning. Samuel Whitmore wasn't just a reluctant participant in Project Heritage. He was deeply embedded in its operations. But even more troubling was a list of names tied to the program, a veritable roster of Charleston's elite. These were people who had everything to lose if their secrets were exposed, and they wouldn't go down quietly. Joe leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I've traced the shell accounts as far as they'll go. Vanguard Horizons is the nexus. Whoever controls that account controls the money and the program." "Do we have anything directly tying it to Margaret's murder?" Harper asked, his tone grim. Joe shook his head. "Not yet. The accounts show regular payments to an operational fund, but without knowing who manages it, we can't prove anything." Grace bit her lip, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "We're close. We just need one more piece. Something that connects the money to whoever ordered Margaret's death." Harper's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's an anonymous tip," he said, reading the message aloud. "There's a safety deposit box at Whitmore Bank. Margaret Whitmore's name is on the account. It might have what you're looking for." The room went still. "A safety deposit box?" Grace echoed. "Why hasn't anyone mentioned this before?" "Because it was probably buried intentionally," Harper said, standing. "We need to move fast. If this tip is legitimate, we're not the only ones who know about it." Grace's pulse quickened as they made their way to the bank. The weight of their discoveries pressed heavily on her, but so did the risk. They weren't just piecing together a decades-old conspiracy. They were poking a sleeping beast. Every step brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. At the bank, Harper flashed his badge, demanding immediate access to the safety deposit box. The manager, a wiry man with thinning hair, hesitated before leading them to the vault. "Miss Whitmore's box hasn't been accessed in years," he said nervously. "I wasn't even aware she had one." The vault was cold and dimly lit, its metal walls humming faintly. The manager unlocked the box and handed it to Grace, who placed it carefully on a nearby table. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside were a stack of documents, a leather-bound journal, and an old cassette tape. Grace's breath caught as she picked up the journal, its worn pages filled with Margaret's elegant handwriting. Flipping through it, she saw detailed notes about Project Heritage, names, dates, and chilling observations about the program's true purpose. "It's all here," she whispered, holding up the journal. "This is what Margaret died for." Harper examined the cassette tape, his brow furrowed. "We'll need to find a player for this. It could be the final piece of evidence." Before they could leave, the sound of footsteps echoed in the vault. Grace froze, her heart racing. Harper motioned for her and Joe to stay behind as he drew his weapon and stepped toward the entrance. Two men in suits appeared, their expressions cold and menacing. "Detective Harper," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. "You're interfering in matters above your pay grade. Hand over the box, and we can all walk away." Harper's grip tightened on his gun. "I don't think so. You want it? Come and take it." The tension in the air was suffocating. Grace clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing for an escape plan. The men exchanged a glance, then stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. Harper returned, his jaw tight. "They're sending a message. We need to move now." They left the bank quickly, the safety deposit box hidden beneath Harper's coat. As they drove to Joe's house, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every car that lingered behind them felt like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. At Joe's, they found an old cassette player and inserted the tape. The room fell silent as Margaret's voice filled the air, her tone calm but laced with urgency. "If you're listening to this, it means I've failed," she began. "I've tried to expose Project Heritage, but the people behind it are too powerful. They've infiltrated every level of our city, our courts, our businesses, even our law enforcement. But the truth is here, in these documents. Use them to finish what I started." Her voice wavered slightly. "And to Samuel, if you're hearing this, know that I did this for you. I wanted to protect you, but I couldn't stand by while they used you as a pawn. You deserve to know the truth. You deserve to be free." The tape ended with a faint click, leaving the room in stunned silence. Grace's eyes burned with unshed tears as she clutched the journal tighter. Margaret's sacrifice had been monumental, but now it was up to her to honor it. The next day, Grace and Harper prepared to present their findings to the district attorney. They had enough evidence to force an investigation: Margaret's journal, the financial records, and the tape. But as they left Joe's house, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You have what you wanted. Now let it go, or you'll regret it. Whoever sent that knows we're close," Harper said grimly. "We can't stop now." But the threats escalated quickly. As Grace returned to her apartment that evening, she found her door ajar. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, finding her belongings ransacked. The journal was still in her bag, but the fear was unmistakable. Someone had been watching her, and they wanted her to know it. Grace called Harper, her voice shaking. "They were here. They know where I live." "Pack a bag," he said immediately. "You're not staying there tonight. We'll figure this out." Grace stayed with Harper that night, but sleep eluded her. The shadows in the room felt alive, the silence oppressive. She couldn't stop replaying Margaret's words in her mind. "The truth is here. Use it." The next morning, Grace, Harper, and Joe delivered the evidence to the district attorney's office. The DA, a stern woman named Lorraine Becker, listened intently as they laid out their case. Her expression grew darker with every new revelation. "This is explosive," Becker said finally, "but it's also dangerous. The people involved in this won't go down without a fight." "Then we fight," Grace said, her voice firm. "Margaret fought for this. My grandfather is sitting on death row because of this. I won't stop now." Becker nodded, her resolve matching Grace's. We'll launch an investigation immediately. But you need to be careful, Miss Caldwell. You've made powerful enemies." As they left the DA's office, Grace felt a flicker of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and the people behind Project Heritage would face justice. But the battle was far from over. The threats, the shadows, the lingering danger, it was all building to a final confrontation. And Grace knew that if she faltered, everything Margaret had fought for would be lost. The mood at the district attorney's office was electric. Lorraine Becker's team had started a preliminary investigation into Project Heritage, and the files Grace had provided were already turning heads. However, Grace couldn't shake the sense of dread that followed her like a shadow. Every time her phone buzzed, or she noticed a car lingering too long behind her, her stomach twisted. The people behind Project Heritage weren't going to let this unravel without a fight. Grace met with Detective Harper later that evening at a safe house arranged by the DA's office. The small, unassuming apartment in a quiet Charleston neighborhood was meant to give her some reprieve from the escalating threats. But the heavy locks on the doors and the drawn blinds only reminded her how much danger she was in. "They're tightening the noose," Harper said as they sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the evidence. "Becker is already facing pressure from higher-ups to back off. Someone's pulling strings." Grace frowned, flipping through Margaret's journal. It's not just about protecting themselves. It's about keeping the system intact. If this comes out, it'll destroy the foundation they've built over decades. Harper nodded. "And they know you're the linchpin. Without you, this investigation falls apart." Grace shivered. The implications were clear. They couldn't scare her off, so they would try something more permanent. "What about Samuel Whitmore?" she asked. "Do you think he'll finally step up?" Harper sighed. "If he had a spine, he would have done it years ago. But I don't think he's beyond hope. Margaret's death shook him, and he's been unraveling ever since. If we can push him, he might just do the right thing." The next day, Grace decided to confront Samuel one last time. Harper insisted on going with her, wary of the growing threats. They arrived at the judge's estate in the late afternoon, the sprawling mansion shrouded in the golden haze of sunset. Samuel greeted them at the door, his face pale and drawn. "This isn't a good time," he said tersely, but Grace pushed past him, her determination overriding her caution. "It's never a good time for the truth, is it?" she said, her voice sharp. "You've spent your entire life hiding from it, but you can't anymore. Not when people are dying because of it." Samuel's expression darkened, but he closed the door and led them into his study. The room felt oppressive, its heavy curtains blocking out the fading sunlight. "What do you want from me?" he asked, sinking into the leather chair behind his desk. "You think I can just snap my fingers and bring it all down? It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," Grace countered, placing Margaret's journal on the desk in front of him. "This is your mother's legacy. She died trying to expose the truth, and you've spent your life protecting the people who killed her. Don't you think it's time to honor her instead?" Samuel stared at the journal, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "If I speak out, it won't just destroy me. It'll destroy everything. My family, my career, this city. Do you really think you can handle that kind of fallout?" "It's not about me," Grace said, her voice softening. "It's about the kids who were taken, the families that were torn apart. It's about Margaret and Ethan and everyone else who's been hurt by this. You can end it, Samuel. You can finally make it right." For a moment, Grace thought she had reached him. Samuel's shoulders sagged and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. But then his face hardened again and he shook his head. "You're asking too much." "No," Grace said firmly. "You just don't have the courage." She turned and walked out of the study, Harper following close behind. As they stepped into the cool evening air, Grace felt a surge of anger and despair. Samuel was a broken man, paralyzed by his own fear. If he wouldn't help, she would have to move forward without him. That night, Grace returned to the safe house, determined to regroup. She and Harper planned to meet with Lorraine Becker the following morning to discuss their next steps. But as she reviewed the evidence once again, her phone buzzed with a message that made her blood run cold. "You've been warned. Now it's too late." A loud crash outside made her jump. Harper, who had been sitting in the living room, rushed to the window. "Stay here," he said, pulling his gun and stepping outside. Grace's heart pounded as she waited in the suffocating silence. Moments later, Harper burst back inside, his face grim. "They found us," he said. "We need to leave. Now." Grace grabbed her bag, clutching Margaret's journal tightly as they fled the house. Harper drove them to a secure location arranged by the DA's office. But the sense of safety was fleeting. The people behind Project Heritage were relentless, and Grace knew they were running out of time. The next morning, they met Lorraine Becker in a nondescript office on the outskirts of Charleston. Becker looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "We have a problem," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "The pressure on this case is mounting. I've already had calls from 2 senators and the mayor, all urging me to back off. They're scared." "Good," Grace said. "That means we're getting close." Becker didn't smile. "Close isn't good enough. We need a decisive blow, something that will make it impossible for them to bury this." Grace thought of the safety deposit box, the journal, the cassette tape. "We have everything," she said. "The financial records, the evidence from Margaret's files. It's all here. What else do we need?" "A confession," Becker said bluntly, "from someone inside the program, someone high enough to implicate the entire operation." Grace's stomach sank. Samuel Whitmore was their best chance, but he had already made it clear he wouldn't cooperate. And even if he did, there was no guarantee his testimony would hold up under scrutiny. As they discussed their options, Grace's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "Meet me at the courthouse tonight. Bring the journal." It was unsigned, but Grace recognized the number. "Samuel, you can't go alone," Harper said immediately. "It's a trap." "Maybe," Grace admitted, "but it might be our only chance to get him on record." That night, Grace stood on the steps of the courthouse, clutching Margaret's journal tightly. The street was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of downtown Charleston replaced by an oppressive stillness. Harper waited nearby, his car idling with the headlights off. Samuel emerged from the shadows, his face drawn and pale. "You came," he said quietly. "I came because I believe in the truth," Grace said. "Do you?" Samuel hesitated, his hands trembling. "I want to, but I'm scared." "Margaret wasn't," Grace said, "and she died for it. Do you really want her death to mean nothing?" Samuel's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll testify." Before Grace could respond, the roar of an engine shattered the silence. A black SUV screeched to a stop, and masked men spilled out, guns drawn. Harper leapt from his car, shouting for Grace to run, but it was too late. The men surrounded them, their weapons trained on Grace and Samuel. "You've caused enough trouble," one of them growled. "Hand over the journal, and this ends here." Grace clutched the journal tighter, her heart racing. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't over." Samuel stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. In that moment of indecision, Harper sprang into action, disarming one of them and shouting for Grace to run. She bolted, clutching the journal as gunshots rang out behind her. When she reached Harper's car, she looked back and saw Samuel standing defiantly, his hands raised as the men restrained him. Grace's heart broke, but she knew she couldn't stop. The truth was all that mattered now, and she would do whatever it took to see it through. The early morning light bathed Charleston in a pale orange hue as Grace sat in the DA's office, her heart pounding. Her hands trembled as she laid out the evidence. Margaret's journal, the financial records, and the cassette tape. Harper had barely made it back with her after the attack the night before. Samuel had been taken, his fate unknown, but his sacrifice had given Grace the chance to push forward. This was it. Her last chance to expose Project Heritage and honor Margaret's legacy. Lorraine Becker, seated across from Grace, reviewed the materials with a grim expression. "This is enough to trigger a grand jury investigation," she said finally, looking up. "But you need to understand, Miss Caldwell, this isn't just about exposing the truth. Once this comes out, the fallout will be enormous." "That's the point," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the weight of Becker's words. "These people have been manipulating lives for decades. It's time they face justice." Becker nodded, her expression softening. "Then let's get to work." While Becker prepared the materials for the grand jury, Grace and Harper worked on another front. The anonymous tipster had sent another message during the night, claiming that Samuel Whitmore was being held at a private estate on the outskirts of Charleston. The estate belonged to one of the names tied to Project Heritage, an influential developer with ties to the city's elite. Grace knew it was a trap, but she also knew she couldn't leave Samuel behind. Harper drove as Grace navigated, her anxiety building with each passing mile. The estate came into view, its towering gates and sprawling grounds a testament to its owner's wealth and influence. Harper parked a safe distance away, and they approached on foot, using the dense trees for cover. The air was thick with tension as they climbed a hill overlooking the main house. Through the binoculars, Grace spotted Samuel. He was seated on a bench near the edge of a meticulously manicured garden, flanked by two armed guards. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. Grace's heart ached at the sight of him, but she forced herself to focus. They needed a plan. "Two guards by him," Harper murmured, scanning the property. "More likely inside. This place is a fortress." "We need a distraction," Grace whispered, her mind racing. "Something to draw them away." Harper nodded. "There's a utility shed near the back. If I can cut the power, it might give us an opening." It was a risky plan, but it was their only option. Harper slipped away, and Grace watched from her vantage point, her pulse pounding. Minutes later, the estate plunged into darkness, the hum of machinery silenced. Shouts echoed across the grounds as the guards scrambled to respond. Grace moved quickly, weaving through the shadows until she reached Samuel. "It's me," she whispered, kneeling beside him. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Grace," he rasped, "what are you doing here?" "Getting you out," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Come on." They moved through the garden, keeping low as the chaos unfolded around them. Harper appeared moments later, his gun drawn. "This way," he said, leading them toward the woods. But their escape was short-lived. A spotlight flared to life, and a voice boomed through the air. "Stop right there or you're all dead." Grace froze, shielding her eyes from the blinding light. Dozens of armed men emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on them. At the center of the group was a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit. Grace recognized him immediately. Edward Prescott, the developer whose name had appeared in Margaret's journal. "Miss Caldwell," Prescott said, his voice cold and smooth. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long." Grace stood her ground, her heart racing. "I have everything I need to expose you," she said. "The DA has the files. It's over." Prescott chuckled, his smile chilling. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you don't understand how this works. People like me, we don't lose. And we certainly don't let little girls with a savior complex take us down." Harper stepped forward, his gun raised. "Let her go," he said. "You've already lost." Before Prescott could respond, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Floodlights bathed the estate as federal agents descended, their voices cutting through the chaos. "This is the FBI. Drop your weapons and surrender." Prescott's composure cracked as his men hesitated, their confidence wavering. "You fools," he snarled. "Do you know who I am?" Grace watched as the agents closed in, their precision and numbers overwhelming Prescott's guards. She felt a surge of relief as Harper grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety. Samuel stumbled beside her, his strength failing after days of captivity. Within minutes, the estate was secured and Prescott was in handcuffs. As the agents led him away, he turned to Grace, his expression venomous. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You have no idea what you've done." Grace met his gaze, unflinching. "I've done what Margaret couldn't. I've exposed the truth." The next day, the grand jury convened and the evidence Grace and Harper had gathered was presented in full. The financial records, the journal, and the cassette tape painted a damning picture of Project Heritage and its architects. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the DA laid out the case, implicating Prescott and others in a decades-long conspiracy. Samuel Whitmore took the stand, his testimony a turning point in the case. His voice trembled as he recounted his role in the program, but he didn't shy away from the truth. "I was complicit," he said, his eyes meeting Grace's across the room. "But I'm here to make it right." The grand jury returned an indictment, and within hours, warrants were issued for dozens of arrests. The news spread like wildfire, shaking Charleston to its core. Politicians, business leaders, and even law enforcement officers were implicated, their carefully constructed lives unraveling. For Grace, the victory was bittersweet. Margaret's sacrifice had finally borne fruit, but the cost had been staggering. She stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed around the DA's office. Harper joined her, his expression weary but proud. "You did it," he said. "You brought them down." Grace shook her head. "We did it. Margaret did it. This isn't just my fight." As the sun set over Charleston, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The truth was out, and justice was finally within reach. But the scars of Project Heritage would linger, a reminder of the darkness that had shadowed so many lives. In the days that followed, Grace returned to Margaret's home, determined to preserve her legacy. She sifted through the remaining files, piecing together the stories of those who had been affected by Project Heritage. It wasn't just about bringing the guilty to justice, it was about helping the victims heal. And as she stood in Margaret's study, the journal open on the desk before her, Grace made a promise to herself. She would keep fighting, not just for Margaret or for Ethan, but for everyone who had been silenced, because the truth mattered, and it always would. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.